We're live? All right then. I guess we're live, right, David? All right then. Well, let's do this. Good morning to my West Coast people. Good afternoon to my East Coast people. I'm Ronald Simpson Bay, the National Director of Outreach and Alumni Engagement for Just Leadership USA. I'm also the national hype man for the organization, the baddest criminal justice reform organization in America, matter of fact. We welcome you to the relaunch of our Facebook Live Just Us discussion series, where we will dive into and explore the COVID-19 situations in our jails and prisons and the work being done to address it. But before we get into introductions, we at Just Leadership USA, we want to recognize, respect, and acknowledge that this Facebook Live event is taking place on the unceded ancestral land of the first people who belong to the many indigenous tribes who inhabited this land now called America. I ask you to join us in acknowledging some of these great tribes: the Apache, the Arapaho, the Blackfoot, the Cherokee, the Chippewa, the Shawnee, the Kiwanee, the Sioux, the Choctaw, the Cheyenne, the Pueblo, and the Seminole, just to name a few. We give honors to the elders of these tribes, both past and present, as well as future generations. Just Leadership stands in solidarity with the national indigenous people in their fight against the exclusions, oppressions, and eliminations they have been subjected to. So as we go forward with this gathering, with this training, with this Facebook Live program, let us do so in respect. At Just Leadership, we are a national criminal justice organization committed to decarcerating America. Because we believe that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solutions, our theory of change is based on the educating, elevating, and empowering of the people and communities that are most impacted by the criminal legal system and systemic racism. We will empower them to drive, amplify, and sustain the kinds of policy reform that builds thriving, sustainable, and healthy communities. Although we are national in scope, we are local in impact. We currently have over 1,100 directly impacted leaders in 45 states plus Washington, D.C., who have gone through either one or both of our leadership development programs for directly impacted people. Last year, in June of 2020, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we launched the Just Us campaign, which calls for legislators to enact proactive solutions to protect the human beings behind bars during pandemic and forthcoming disasters. When the pandemic hit and we began looking for a way to respond in an impactful way, what we discovered was that there were no emergency management plans for evacuating or protecting incarcerated people in our nation's jails and prisons. Our research revealed that during Hurricane Katrina in 2006, officials in New Orleans had evacuation plans for the cats and dogs at the Humane Society, but they did not have an evacuation plan for the people in their correctional facilities. Many of those incarcerated people were left locked in their cells while staff fled to safety in the face of the rising floodwaters. Others were herded like cattle onto bridge overpasses to escape the flooding jail cells. So, as part of our Just Us campaign, we have outlined recommendations for immediate emergency preparedness plans for those in the criminal legal system. These policy recommendations could lead to potentially historic legislation in every state in our country. This is a nationwide call for policymakers to decarcerate the United States by immediately adopting our federal and state-based policy recommendations to save the lives of incarcerated people during any type of major crisis or emergency, which again is especially timely given the current rise of the Delta variant strain of COVID, which is ravaging our country. But today, join me for this powerful conversation. We have two great guests for you. Lulu Cameron, who is the founder and executive director at South Carolina for Restorative Justice. She's doing amazing work down there, and we love for her to give her presentation and for you to hear from her. And Brother Minister Khalif Muab Il, who is the founder and CEO of Breaking Barriers Mentoring Incorporated, and he's the director of All of Us or None in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Please join me and welcome our esteemed guests, and we're glad to have you. I look forward to your presentations. And at this time, would you guys take time, Lulu? Would you start us off by introducing yourself to our audience?
Oh, no pressure, no pressure. Absolutely. So, my name is Lulu Cameron, and I am the founder of South Carolina for Restorative Justice. And, you know, my introduction to criminal justice reform or things like that just come from having a loved one who's incarcerated and learning more about the impacts of incarceration and things that take place on the inside of institutions. And so definitely when COVID-19 hit, it was just like a call to action all across this country. It was a position that if you were a human, you couldn't necessarily avoid getting involved and trying to ensure that human life is respected in all walks, in all paths. And so that is pretty much where a lot of us started getting our feet wet as it related to the institutions and things that take place on the inside of them. And so I've just been moving on since then. I work as an advocate. I work to bring information to legislators to help them make informed decisions about the need for change in different states, as well as I work directly with some of the departments in order to help them to find a bridgeway for solutions for things that are happening inside of the institutions that they may be unaware of, as well as things that they can do to make things better.
Fantastic, fantastic. And you're doing a great job of making things better as well.
Thank you.
Brother Khalif, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience, please?
Definitely. My name is Minister Khalif Muabel. I'm the executive director of Breaking Barriers Mentoring Inc., and I'm also the president of All of Us Anon Wisconsin, which makes up about maybe 31, 32 chapters across the country. I'm definitely directly impacted. I served 10 years in solitary confinement, 15 years in total, in one of the worst prisons in the country. And I've been doing this work for over 11 years since my release from prison back in 2011. And I've worked with everybody from every part of government you can think of, all the way down to the laymen of the streets. And it's my goal to interrupt the cycles of mass incarceration across the globe.
Thank you for that introduction. And to our Facebook audience, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Facebook feed or the chat box, and we will try to field your questions in live time as we go forward. So as we move forward, Minister Muabi, I guess the first question is for both of you. Can you describe your work around the Justice Campaign? Talk to us. You heard me give an overview of what the campaign is about, and Minister, you've been with us for a while on this campaign. So could you start off by telling us what your involvement has been with this with the Justice Campaign?
Well, our involvement has been overbroad. I think we did the first march for Just Us, for the Just Us campaign, and the march was to raise awareness around the poor practices of DOC, DOJ, and the like. And we had a billboard reveal. We kicked off the campaign with a billboard reveal, a march, a rally, and a little bit of a concert. That's how we kicked off the campaign. And since then, what we've been doing is we've been meeting with the local government agencies and as well as the DOC here in the state to talk about some strategies around how they can develop an appropriate evacuation plan, that has details about how the reentry back into the community works, how that looks, what that looks like. Also resources for people who are coming home. But on the inside, the use of solitary confinement to conquer this pandemic, I believe, is definitely inhumane. A lot of the people who are on the inside are either confined to a room, they're in quarantine, and there's no rec, there's no access to the phones that frequently. There is a quarantine unit that is segregation that they put people into in a lot of these institutions to separate or isolate the people from general population, which I understand on one end, but on the other end, these people are being deprived of a lot of privileges and rights that the other similarly situated people are afforded, and that within itself is an injustice. So, talking about how the evacuation plan looks like, what that looks like, and also how do we not impose or superimpose more oppression as a result of a pandemic in this country on people who are currently incarcerated. And that is really important. But we've also utilized this campaign to capitalize on the pandemic to get more people free from the prisons and more people free from the jails. Since this pandemic, with the Just Us campaign, we've been able to get at least 15 to 25% of both the prison population modified as well as the jail population here in the state of Wisconsin. And we're not going to stop there. We're going to keep beating up the concrete. And I know that this new Delta strand, this Delta variant is definitely on the rise. And because of that, the DOC is shut down again in Wisconsin, and the county jail has shut down once again in Wisconsin. And again, we're going to be looking at the constitutionalities behind those practices that they're going to employ as a result of that.
Thank you for your perspective. Appreciate it. Lulu, can you describe your work around the Justice Campaign and what you're doing around the COVID-19 situation in your community?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Initially when everything kind of kicked off, it was the unknown, right? And we started with a rally to kind of organize ourselves in order to come up with an idea of what we can actually do, considering that everything was pretty much shutting down. So, we started with a rally. We moved into an email campaign where we email people, whether it be inside of the Department of Corrections and, as far as congressmen and the president and people in the DOJ, to notify them of the inhumane conditions that have been taking place inside of the institutions in an excessive amount as a result of COVID-19. I think you and I can all agree it was very difficult for us to even sit in the house for 2 months, let alone be looking at basically sitting in a lockup situation for 2 years. So, I've just been really working hard to kind of help to, like Khalif said, use this as an opportunity to basically open up a segue into how can we make things better on a whole progressively, because it wouldn't have been so difficult for us to find people to release if you had effective programming within the institutions, effective good time behavior documented. You would know exactly who to go to and how to do it so that it was safe for society, and also the people who were being released were actually ready to be released because they have already walked a path of redemption. So I think that people explain the COVID-19 situation as something that kind of blew the roof off of the top of the Department of Corrections, and it exposed everything on the inside. And I always like to compare it to the inside of a woman's trunk in her car. We got all kind of stuff back there, shoes, perfume, all kinds of things, but it's all over. And so with that happening, people were able to see exactly what was going on inside of these institutions and the inhumane conditions. And I think that when you're talking about something as simple as taking a shower, having that not be considered a necessity. You have people going weeks or 2 weeks at a time due to staffing shortages or the over inundation of the pandemic, in any given location. It becomes very difficult to kind of console people who are incarcerated and are under those circumstances, especially when they're not being viewed as human beings. And so, a lot of it was a lot of the hype that I noticed was always put on the correctional officers who were still working throughout the pandemic. But, my best analogy is to say, correctional officers being overworked through pandemic is kind of like your mom coming home after a bad day's work and she just doesn't want to deal with you. And so you saw an increase in abuse. You saw an increase in neglect of power, and it was unfortunate. So we started to build bridges with department leadership, with legislators, with people who are in positions to help us push forward the narrative. And, we are by far where we would like to be in the state of South Carolina specifically, but we have been able to have some reach in other places all across this country. And so I think that that is important in itself, because if nothing else, I feel like the pandemic has showed this country, society, and anyone who believes that people should do the crime if they do the time if they've done the crime, that there are a lot of inhumane things that are taking place inside of a system that we're saying is in essence there to be a rehabilitative effort.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for pointing that out and recognizing it. I want go ahead. I want to recognize one of our audience members, Renee Mitchell. Thanks for joining, Renee. Renee is, what's your title, Renee? I just saw it a minute ago. Anyway, Renee she asked a question. She asked, why isn't there a plan for incarcerated people being released from jail with housing and workforce mental health if they need it? And she points out how New York had released 191 incarcerated people recently because of COVID. And that's a great question, Renee. But for the purposes of our campaign, the Just Us campaign, it focuses on the actual release of people from jails and prisons. We don't deal with the aspect of what happens after they release, because the pandemic happened so fast. Everybody was rushing, trying to make something happen. So it's kind of like jumping off the cliff and building your wings on the way up. So we are taking care of our portion of it by addressing the people that's actually locked up in jails and prison. Now, once they get out, we hope some other organizations and companies such as yours can step in and fill the gap to help provide those type of services for people that need them once they come out. So I would turn to the next question to our panelists. Beyond the risk of infection and death due to COVID-19, what are other instances of harm of incarcerated people have faced due to the pandemic? What have you guys seen in your jurisdictions around this?
Well, I've seen, because we work with brothers directly inside of the system, and one guy, I'm not going to say his name, but he called me through this thing we have here called HomeWave, and he was in a quarantine unit, and in the quarantine unit they had not yet provided them with masks, and so they were putting socks over their mouths and over their noses. And so we ended up helping him get contact with a media outlet on the outside. He was able to do an interview with the news via the HomeWave. And as a result of him doing that interview and putting the system kind of on blast, he was exposed to all kind of retaliatorial practices and things of that nature. And so he ended up getting revocated, even though there was a minimum of evidence against him and all kind of things that happened as a result of that. And then I have another guy who kicked off the actual, he actually kicked off the whole COVID-19 on the inside. He was infected with COVID-19, and this was before anyone knew what the pandemic was or what the actual virus was itself. But he just know that this was something that he had never felt before. He had a burning sensation in his chest. He couldn't taste, couldn't smell, etc. And he had complained to the guards on the inside that, listen, something is wrong with me. And when he went to the healthcare unit gave him a Tylenol and told him to go back and that he's going to be fine. Well, come to find out, about a week later, after he had been sitting in the unit with a population of maybe 60 to 75 people in this unit, he found out later that he had COVID-19. And so as a result of him having it for a week and it not being treated, he infected the entire unit, COVID-19. Now, they moved him as if that was going to purge the virus from the unit. They moved him to a quarantine unit. And once he left the quarantine unit, he was put onto another unit where he was infected with the virus again from other people on that unit. So he went back to the quarantine unit and went back to the unit that was quarantined, that had been free and clear of the virus and infected that unit again. So he essentially caught COVID-19 3 times. And this was a guy fighting his case. He's free now as a result of all of this. And he was fighting a case, someone that they could have easily put on some kind of a justice point program or something like that, could have let him go and had that situation taken care of on the outside. But they let him infect a multitude of different populations that were similarly situated with him on the inside. The other thing that we've seen that perpetuate throughout the whole system, even on the inside of the Department of Corrections here. But this was in the House of Corrections and then the county jail. The county jail was making vaccinations mandatory for people coming in. And if they didn't take the vaccination, they would be locked in solitary confinement for the duration of their time there. And that practice was kind of like forcing people to take the shot. Well, people took the shot, and then they found out that the shot didn't stop them from getting this new Delta variant. And actually, some of them were carriers of the new Delta variant. And so the whole population on the inside was put on lockdown, but they're refusing to release people. So our goal is to go in there and force them to start releasing people and not have people sitting in there incubating and suffering in the violence, in this virus. So the thing that we led the campaign with, we started the campaign with a slogan, and the slogan was that they were sentenced to time and not death. And we don't want people to be exposed to potential fatalities when some of them are only facing 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. Some of them have 2 years in prison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this virus shouldn't claim their lives because they have no way out. I just think that within itself is an injustice, and that's an injustice that we're going to continue to fight.
Absolutely, absolutely. They weren't, like you said, they weren't sentenced to death. They were sentenced to a short period of time. And I think to compound the situation, Minister, is the fact that we know that the correctional officers and staff are the one that's bringing the virus into facilities now, because they've been on lockdown for over a year, and a lot of them are refusing to take the the vaccination shot themselves. So we have a real dire situation in our jails and prisons, because people who can't defend themselves, they can't social distance, they don't have access to personal protection equipment, that they're being exposed to this virus by staff who refuse to take the vaccine. So those are definitely situational problems we need to address. And what about you, Lulu? In your jurisdiction, what other harms and instances have you seen incarcerated people face due to the pandemic?
So for me, it's just really heavy, because I think there was such a delayed response to those who were incarcerated in the state of South Carolina as it relates to taking on the pandemic. Initially it was, South Carolina in itself, they had not necessarily taken the pandemic seriously. And the response was that we're not going to waste the resources initially. And then as the cases began to pile up and the bodies began to pile up, because a lot of people died in the state of South Carolina because of COVID. People that could have been saved, people who were, getting ready to be released, people who were looking forward to starting their lives over again. And so the hardest thing for me is to be representing a state that fought to have a heartbeat bill for the unborn, but yet when that heartbeat turns into a troubled child or someone who has experienced some type of disconnect within their grow up or has committed some level of a crime, then they are no longer considered the same heartbeat, I guess. And so, that was really something that was difficult for me to kind of play with, because I don't understand that. And so as a person who values life and I value people, and I understand that good people or people make mistakes sometimes. And obviously, like Minister Khalif said, they weren't there for a death sentence. So many people, lost out and lost their lives. And then let's think about the ramifications of COVID. I have a friend who is very close to me who she was very, very sick after COVID. The ramifications went on for months and she still experiences the headaches. So, what about in institutions where they're only providing them with Tylenol? You can't breathe, you get Tylenol. You got a headache, you get Tylenol. If your nose is running. And so what we do know is that COVID impacted people in a lot of different ways that they weren't even able to kind of put their hands on it. It was bigger than a sore throat or a stuffy nose. People had aneurysms, people had all different types of impacts from COVID. And so I think it's just really disheartening to me to be in a state where they don't necessarily care about the heartbeat, although they fought for it. And then to watch people's mental health deteriorate. The state of South Carolina still has not resumed any level of visitation. However, except for in some level 1 institutions, and it's very few of them. So you have, not only do you have those who are incarcerated being in long, extensive stints of lockdown situations in very small cells with another person, and sometimes there's plumbing issues, and a lot of times there's issues with the food. If you have a COVID dorm, people not receiving hot food for excessive amounts of time, or a very small amount of food. We're talking about grown men and grown women. And then think about the children and how they have been impacted. And you've seen kind of how some of the things have played out with the Department of Juvenile Justice in South Carolina with this adding on to it. And so I think that there has not been a large consideration to mental health. I think that there has not been a large consideration to the families of the incarcerated, the children that are impacted by not seeing their family or parents, mother, father in almost 2 years. That bond is still necessary. Just because a person is in prison doesn't mean that they cannot still try to do the best that they can for their families. But this has almost created in a situation where it's almost impossible. And in South Carolina, unfortunately, we don't know when we'll see the end of it. There's no conversation, no discussion. And so I just know the long lasting effects of, being put in solitary confinement and how it deteriorates the brain within just a matter of hours. It starts deteriorating. And now we're talking about 2 years time where people are stuck and they're not able to go to programming. They're not able to have any interactions, but they are able to work. If there are yards that have, prison labor, you are able to get out and work, and it is an expectation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like that you mentioned that South Carolina has the heartbeat bill, and because it's just it just goes to show the nature of the people that implement these bills, or that call for these bills, and it calls all lives matter and right to life, and all those things only apply when it's to a certain segment of people. When you talk about people that's incarcerated, or Black and brown communities, they don't really care if those particular bills and provisions apply to those people. So that's one of the hurdles that we face in this whole thing around elevating the COVID-19 provisions. And speaking of which, I guess I'm curious to hear from you guys, what have been the largest obstacles so far in advocating for emergency management plans in correctional facilities? I talked earlier about in New Orleans, they had plans to evacuate the cats and dogs at the Humane Society, but nothing for the people. So we're trying to pass this legislation. I'm just curious, as what have you seen in your individual jurisdictions around the obstacles for passing these emergency management plans?
Yeah, I really haven't seen any. I haven't seen any big push. Even though, like in South Carolina, I know the ACLU pushed for the release of elderly people who had some level of illness or ailment, some health release conditions, and there still wasn't a whole lot of that. So I did not, it's almost like, what are they holding on to so tightly that they just can't let anyone go? I mean, because it's not like the parole, they started releasing a greater number of people in parole. They're still only paroling at 8% in South Carolina. So I really did not see anything that gave me any level of encouragement or hope in regards to their practices.
Well, personally,
what about you, Khalif?
well, we're seeing a very, we're seeing a very slow kind of like a trickle effect on in the DOC and the House of Corrections and the county jails dealing with this pandemic. They're slow to release people, but they are definitely releasing people. I think that some of part of the reason why they're so slow to do it is because the mindset of the DOC or the system here in the state of Wisconsin, they believe that everybody who is even being tried is already guilty of a multiplicity of whatever. And our people never get a fair chance and a fair shot and a fair shake anyway. So they are still under the auspices that we are violent, that we shouldn't be released, and things of that nature. But we're turning attention to the most vulnerable people on the inside, people who have compromised immune systems. What about the people with respiratory situations that the DOC is not equipped properly to deal with on the inside? What about the people who have diabetes and all of those particular things that have actually aged past the point where they could be committing crimes in their life and things of that nature? So we're turning attention to the most vulnerable people on the inside, and some of those people are definitely able to come home, but they're slow to let those people go as well. Excuse me. And then there are those who are already on the cusp of being released. Like, these people are about 6 months, 8 months, 9 months away from being released. What is so difficult about letting someone go 8, 9, 10 months in advance, right? Especially when they've already taken care of all of their programmatic needs. There's no need to just warehouse people, especially during the pandemic. And the DOC is really, in the state of Wisconsin, they are really bent on the culture of warehousing. And that means that there's no substantive programs or anything like that on the inside. So a lot of these so-called brothers and sisters just sit, and they're just sitting with no kind of productivity that they can become engaged in or anything like that. They're just sitting. So the DOC has a culture where they like to warehouse us, and we know all of the variables behind why that is. But during the pandemic, we're talking about lives. We're talking about people who actually live and breathe with a spirit and a human soul. We're talking about those people. It's no time for people to be looking at all the crime or this or that or all of those big things. We're talking about life right now. And we're in a state of an emergency. And by being in a state of an emergency, some of those things you can't even look at from a moral perspective when we're having to look at those things in contrast to human life, right? And so we don't feel like the urgency is there in the state of Wisconsin as it should be when we're dealing with lives, and to treat people like they are property, just to warehouse them in a system without any kind of compassion for their humanity, for me is unjust. And also it creates that beast system, and it shows us that beast feel. It can kind of give us that beast effect. And that's what's happening, because there's absolutely no urgency when it comes to this pandemic. And this Delta variant is way worse than the ones before it. Absolutely. So now we're really looking at those vulnerable adults that are on the inside, those people who are, and even the mentally ill people too. It's just so much. It's so, and we're talking about a system that's made up of about 70% of people with MH1s, with people with severe and progressive mental illness. And we're talking about leaving these people in a situation and in an environment where their mental illnesses can be exacerbated by 10, and then they're trapped in a situation that they can ultimately lose their lives. That we have to change, and we have to change it quickly.
Absolutely. Minister, you brought up a good point. You talked about, how people are, they're close to their out dates and they can reasonably be released. back to the community because they 6 months away from coming home, 9 months, a year, what have you. And I just kind of wanted to point out for our audience the dire need of the situation, the scope of the situation. We know that the federal prison system houses about 250,000 people, not very many people. It's 2.1 million people incarcerated in the country. But the federal prison system houses just over 200,000 people. And they have a provision called compassionate release, where they can release people during pandemics and emergencies, what have you, under the compassionate release. But the federal prison granted only 36 out of 31,000 compassionate release requests since COVID. 31,000 people have asked for compassionate release, and only 31 people got it. That tells you the scope of the problem, which is so insane. And that's just in the federal system. Multiply that times 10 to the larger state and local system, and now you get an idea of what the numbers actually are.
Yeah, so, most definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my next question to you guys: how did existing conditions and systemic failures worsen the toll of COVID-19 on incarcerated populations? What have you seen in that?
Well, I think just for myself and my knowledge of what goes on inside of the institutions in South Carolina is that there's a lack of programming in general. And, my goal is potentially for there to be some level of behavioral incentive that's put into place for all who are incarcerated. And the reason why is because we don't have any type of incentive that kind of falls in that realm, but there wouldn't have been such a question of moral discernment, right? And why are you looking at it through the eyes of an emergency with a tighter scope of moral discernment than you've ever looked at it before? It's like, we've got to make sure that this person has, been squeaky clean the entire time, when ultimately we see a lot of different things happening on a regular day-to-day basis. And so I think that for me, the biggest thing and the biggest takeaway that they need to be looking at is that there needs to be some type of incentivized programming, that you're not just pulling a rabbit out of a hat because you have no clue. And the sad part is even though they don't use that type of programming in the state of South Carolina as they do in other places, they still calculate it. So there are people that are easy to identify by their behaviors, by their mannerisms, by their walk through their incarceration, that could tell you, yes or no, I'm ready to go. But what I often hear legislators say is that we're so afraid of releasing a lot of people into society and creating a dangerous situation. Well, A1, if you have the proper rehabilitative programming and you are working on reentry from the day that they walk into that door, you wouldn't be scared, because you would know that you have equipped them with the tools in which they need in order to move forward and come out and back into society and be a productive citizen. A lot of times what you hear or see in the Department of Corrections is that if you want rehabilitation, if you want redemption, you're going to have to seek it yourself. And so you have those people who do that. But everybody, you can't always get something out of somebody that wasn't put into them. And so I think that since the departments and the legislators and the states are the keeper of the finances, let's stop making this about a money thing. Let's make it about a human thing. Let's stop just incarcerating people, warehousing them for extraneous amount of that time, and reinfecting communities with cancer that you're so worried about because you didn't take the time to try to heal it. All it takes is a little bit of effort and not even a whole lot of money. I mean, if you're putting absolutely nothing towards it, if you just went ahead and put 2 or 3% towards more rehabilitative efforts, more programming that taught people how to adjust once they return to society, there wouldn't be such the need for all of this fear mongering that we put into place. And people buy into it because all people on the outside of prison see is the danger that's going on in the communities, that's on the social justice on the forefront with the police and with the gangs and with things going on in their own neighborhood. They don't associate that with people who have served 15, 20, 25, 30 plus years in prison and have walked the path of redemption and will be great to get out into society and actually be a part of the solution. But that's just my opinion.
And a strong opinion it is. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
What about you, Minister? What have you seen? How did the existing conditions and systemic failures worsen the toll of COVID-19 on people inside the jails and prisons in your community?
Well, I'm a strong believer that systems aren't built off whim. I'm a strong believer that they are built off extreme calculation, think tanks, things of that nature. I believe that a great deal of pause, ingenuity, creativity, et cetera, goes into the plot of constructing a system such as an incarceration beast, right? So I'm where I'm lost at is how come in the process you don't pre-plan to think about pandemics, natural disasters, things of that nature, and already have a plan in place for that for human being and human lives. I'm kind of trying to figure out whether or not they looked at us only as livestock or human beings. Because if they looked at us as human beings, the first policy or the first principle of survival would be naturally put into the equation. And I would think that they would try to find ways to preserve life as opposed to leave it in jeopardy. That's one thing. Secondly, the zeitgeist, the mindset around corrections in the state of Wisconsin, it's believed that the people that are in prison or incarcerated are violent, and they're going to come out and create this whole extremism of violence, and they're going to just run the streets and do whatever they want to do with no kind of leash on them. But the fact of the matter is, the sore reality is that over 64% of the men and women incarcerated in the state of Wisconsin are nonviolent. They are there for nonviolent offenses, right? And in addition to that, when the Truth in Sentencing bill was enacted here in the state of Wisconsin, before the Truth in Sentencing bill, we had about 893 releases on parole. Since Truth in Sentencing and the Scott Walker's regime, we've only had 150. Okay? Now, we see that the mindset of the DOC is to incarcerate and keep people locked up as long as possible. And the overtone is that these people deserve to be locked up, and there is nothing that can change the mindset or the culture of the DOC. So when you have that kind of a mindset and a culture already in place, faced with a pandemic, it's going to create the resistance like it has done to release people. Like, these people are already ready to be out. You know, we got over 1,500 people right now ready to be released on parole. But because the parole board has been dissolved since 1999, and they only keep it up for old law so-called inmates, then that culture of truth and sentencing is trickling over, and these 1,500 to 2,000 people now are stuck in there during the pandemic. Then we do have this, I believe it's Sector 21, where there is a passionate release process, right? For people who are vulnerable adults, advanced in age, and things of that nature. And I know that a lot of people have applied, and those people were not granted that passionate release. So there are a lot of variables, and we're fighting against a multiplicity of different kinds of weapons that have been created through culture in the state of Wisconsin. So the goal for us is to bring forth those parole people who are eligible for parole and say, hey, these people you can let these people go now. They've done everything that they've needed to do. They're just sitting ducks right now. This is just warehousing at this point, and it's not productive. It has nothing to do with rehabilitative goals or anything like that. Keeping them locked up longer actually is more of a detriment to them in their successful transition in the community as opposed to a benefit. And then these vulnerable adults we're bringing forth and say, okay, this guy is 60 years old with a respiratory situation, and he's exposed to a population of people who, if one gets sick, the whole joint gets sick, and this person could potentially die. This man should be removed from this environment. Those people also need to be pushed to the front. The people who have severe and progressive mental illnesses that have not committed violent offenses and that are within the scope of 5 to 6 months, in 5 years to 6 months in prison, these people should also be looked at as people who are potential to be released, right? So it's just going in and making sure that we're beating up the concrete out here in the world and making sure that we're interfacing with systems, whether they be appointed or elected, to raise awareness about this pandemic and make sure that we create the state of urgency from the outside so that it can trickle onto the inside and our brothers and sisters can come home.
Yes.
Absolutely. Bravo. Absolutely. As we head into this last portion, before we close, I want to be mindful. I want to acknowledge some of our followers, friends, and supporters of Just Leadership and Facebook. Nikki Ellis, thanks for joining, Nikki. Brooke Nicole, Renee Mitchell. I see Sean Wanzo on here. Hey, Sean. Lisa Riley, thanks for joining. Of course, Lester and Hakeem, our staff, thanks for joining. Love you guys. Who else we got on here? Brianna Wynn, thanks for joining. Wanda Brown. Thanks for all you guys for jumping in and having this conversation with us. As we turn to get ready to close now, I'll ask my esteemed panelists, if you guys don't mind sharing your contact information, I'll copy it and put it into the Facebook live chat so our audience can contact you guys. But the final question I think I want to ask you guys is, how can the community support incarcerated people and the Just Us campaign from your perspective? What do you guys think?
I think it's simple. Just get involved. I mean, I think that more often than not, we work in silos. That's a very common word. And we're always working against one another instead of working together. And I think that if we understood the magnitude of numbers and the power that we have as a unity, as a group of people trying to move forward, and not always just focusing, having multiple different focuses. I think that if we come into working with other people with an open mind and the having an end goal in mind, we would really be able to see a lot of things be accomplished, not just in one place, but in a lot of places across the entire country. And I think that that's important for people to understand, that nothing happens if we don't decide to work together. And unfortunately, in this realm, we need everybody who is willing to be a voice, willing to be a hand, willing to be some eyes, ears, and feet, because there are not enough of us fighting for justice in the system who is consistently shown itself to be unjust.
You said a mouthful. The system is certainly unjust, and we're not going to change the system by sitting on our hands. So we need all hands on deck. We know that the Black and Brown community is the most impacted community in the country around COVID-19, in jails and prisons, and in the free world. So it only makes sense for all of us to kind of connect, join forces, and make sure that we all get in this fight together. Absolutely. And before I turn over to you, Minister, I'd like to shout out to Teresa Godfrey. Teresa is one of our leaders, and glad she could join. Thanks for joining us, Teresa. What's your thoughts, Minister?
Well, I'm a strong believer that it is just us. And the fact of the matter is that directly impacted people across the globe got to come together and liberate our voices. We're making up about maybe 70-something million strong in the country. Directly impacted people, whether they be inside or outside. We are a force. We are our own political base if we band together and join forces together. But in this particular instance, definitely joining forces and building a safety net so that the people who are coming home to our community will have a soft landing, right? So that means that the people who are in reentry, the people who are working on mass incarceration, the people who are involved in passionate release and all of these particular things around the issues of mass incarceration, those people should be on the outside with a plan as well to receive the people that we're fighting to break free from the prison system. So there needs to be a front end and a back end approach if we're going to guarantee the success of the people coming home after or during this pandemic, And we need to make sure that we understand that their success out here is important for our campaign. Because if they come out here with no resources and they come out here illy prepared and there's no one to catch them for that soft landing, then they might recidivate. And then that puts a damp in our campaign, because then the DOC and the systems that be can say, oh, we told you so. They're just going to commit more crimes, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to be just as intentional to make sure that these people maintain their freedom and that their successes are intact. And that means that we need the resources out here in the community already created and ready for them when they come home. And we need to make sure that we are just as intentional as freeing our people as they are locking them up and keeping them locked up. So we got to have the same kind of urgency to free our people and keep our people free that they have to keep our people incarcerated and to keep them perpetuating a cycle of incarceration. So that kind of urgency, we as a people, just us, directly impacted people and our allies, we need to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to make sure that we interface with these systems. We can say, hey, you don't have an excuse to keep them in there because we got this out here for them to come home to, and we got them. We don't need you to have them. We got them. And we're going to take care of our business to make sure that they stay free. I think that, coupled with the passion in the movement, I think we'll be fine.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as long as we got passionate leaders like you out there in the field, I know that we're gonna have some great results and I thank both of you, my esteemed panelists, for the work that you're doing in your communities. You are true leaders, you're passionate, you're visionary, and people in the community definitely benefit from your presence there. We got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to give each one of you opportunity to leave the audience with a parting thought, a word, something that's resonating with you guys around the work that you do and around the COVID-19 situation, or anything in general around, the advocacy work that would be a good thought for our audience to take with them as they go back to their communities. Lulu?
I think the one thing that I could say is respect that we all have different circumstances and situations. And for those who elect to be involved in the process of taking down or making changes of a broken system, that we have got to work together. If we do not work together, it's just my voice and it's your voice saying something different. And there's all these different paths in which they're looking to follow and no solid foundation. And so I think if we can get together on the outside and work to build some level of solid foundation, and then those who are incarcerated, they're not handicapped. They are more than capable of also being a part of the solution. And so I think that there needs to be a push on both sides to educate all parties involved and understand that this is an elephant, and you can only bite it and eat it at one, take one bite at a time in order to alleviate or get rid of it. And there's enough of us out here, and there's enough work to do that we don't have to fight for the different things that we see other people doing. We can join them and help to push their initiative. They can join us and help to push our initiative. It shouldn't be so cut and dry. I sit over here in this house and you sit over here in that house, and we don't work together at all, but there's 20 people in each house. So my thing is, I just want to see us all working more collectively and together to actually bring a solution, and and just not being so combative in regards to having our names put in the light, having our voices heard, trying to be the receiver of the person, the next Nobel Peace Prize. I want to see some people home. I want to see some families rejoined. I want to see some generations of generational curses being just blown up. I want to change the history that we have put in place with this system. And for lack of knowledge, we continue to perish. We refuse to pay attention to the details. We refuse to listen to those things that are important to us in regards to changing, or they don't necessarily impact us directly. And so we turn our nose or turn our eyes because you don't understand what that's like. But if we looked at things from the component or the perspective of being global citizens, then every single person has a place. And if we are only as strong as our weakest link, we need to work on the weakest links.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So powerful. Thank you so much. Minister, in 60 seconds or so, take us home.
Well, my job is to liberate the voice of the voiceless. And the people are going to believe whatever the system put forth. If they believe that everybody is violent in the system and that these people are not worthy to come home and that they should be locked up, well, I present people like Hakeem Crampton. I present people like myself. I present people like Jerome Dillard, yourself, Brother Ronald Simpson Bay. I present those people because these are the people who came out and made a difference in the world. And the same thing, that potential lies in every single man and woman whose life is in jeopardy right now inside the system during this pandemic. That hope is still there. And that hope can be shut down by this pandemic, and they may never have an opportunity to have their voices heard. And their suffering is definitely not going in vain. And like the sister said, we need to make sure that our intentions are clear and pure, and make sure that we're coming together and not working in silos and in unison with one another to make the punch much harder to break down those walls and free all our people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, on behalf of Just Leadership USA, I certainly want to extend a very heartfelt thanks and a measure of gratitude to both Lulu, you and the minister for bringing your powerful presentations, your story, not only to our audience, but to the national audience. You guys are true leaders in your areas, in your department, and I love what you do. Lulu, you're a woman after my own heart. When you talked about the incarcerated people on handicap, and they can help as well. Just Leadership believes that those closer to the problem are closer to the solution, furthest away from resources and power. So we definitely advocate for putting the people incarcerated in closer proximity to these initiatives that we hosting out here in the community. So with that, I will bid you both an adieu. I would thank our audience, our Facebook audience, our national audience, and all our supporters across the country. Keep doing what you do. Keep rising. If you want more information about Just Us, our campaign, I put the link in the just Facebook chat. So click on the link. Go check out what we're doing for Just Us. There's a letter writing campaign to your local legislator about supporting this emergency management plan. We're pushing in the federal government, and we need all hands on deck. So let your fingers do the walking, get those letters out, and let's make this happen. I bid you all, as I came, peace. Thank you.